Hello, and welcome to Free Your Mind with Dr. Sheena Mason. The following is a radio interview I did with Pam McElvane on the Inclusive Voice radio show. Enjoy.
The following program, The Inclusive Voice, is sponsored by Diversity MBA Media, and to the extent applicable, their guests. The views and opinions expressed therein do not necessarily reflect those of NewsWeb Radio Company or its management.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to The Inclusive Voice with your host, Pam McElvane, on this holiday weekend. We're happy to have you join us and get some coffee, and here we have our leaders and trailblazers this morning that we're going to have a conversation once again about impactful change, how race in America has manifested in our lives today, and what we can do about decolonizing it and what makes it so significant. But before we go into introducing our special guest, I was just thinking and reflecting upon the impact of George Floyd's murder a year later, the 1-year anniversary. You know, we're very clear in terms of what's happened in the community, the impact that his death has had in shifting the focus and the consciousness of so many people. But in corporate America and large organizations who employ thousands of people, you know, they too have paused. And they recognize that they needed to shift and gain a better understanding to level set, you know, what they just haven't acknowledged before in their workforce, the atrocities that have existed, that have pained their employees of color on an everyday basis. They were not even aware of the microaggressions that employees of color, including their senior leaders, were dealing with because of systemic racism. And so it hasn't just been limited to the fear of mothers and police brutality, black and brown mothers, and what's going on. You know, we are also facing the issues among ethnic groups that have a level of dissension and hate that has been festering in silence. So, you know, when I reflect on how the consciousness has been raised among those that have privilege and influence, and the efforts that have been made across the nation, I mean, even including the world, to acknowledge the existence of inequities and privilege more than it ever has before. And the need and urgency to have diversity and inclusion roles filled has become acknowledged, but even more so, they've been elevated as a symbol of recognition. Where we must be careful, where CEOs in providing this pledge to move forward have to make sure they provide the resources and investments so that the work can be done, so that the work can be sustained in a positive and meaningful way. So I celebrate CEOs like Salesforce who acknowledged that they needed to be accountable. So wanted to do a self-audit, actually conducted a self-audit within his organization, but he went a step further to self-correct. While he was criticized for doing that, it's important that CEOs act upon pledges that they're doing, because the reality is that we do have groups that are demonstrating what they want to do around the fundamental belief system. Because when you make a pledge, it has to be real. After all, we have the Pledge of Allegiance to our country, right? The Pledge of Allegiance to America. For united, we all stand. Divided, we fall. I mean, we've lived on that mantra for so long. So I think about all of this after the aftermath of George Floyd's death, the loss of life of so many others. He was not the first, but he is one today that's prominent where legislation with action has been brought forward. And yet so many still do not believe that change will come. But we have to, in the midst of progress, celebrate the small steps, right? It's a substantial increase that organizations are making and communities are making to be authentic and to have some difference occur. So finally, I would say that heightened awareness has increased work opportunities for so many folks in this space. But it's about getting back to the core values and investing in what's true so that we can have fostered, deep meaning and relationships every day. I will say to you that so much has converged, but let's take a lesson and pull a nugget to go forward. Because the most powerful learnings today is that legislation and policy is what's going to break down systemic racism. So that means there's power in our voices, there's power in organizing, and there's power in standing up with what you believe for. So we're going to take a commercial break and we'll be right back with you with our special guest, Dr. Sheena Mason. Welcome back to the Inclusive Voice. I'm your host, Pam McElvane. Oh, I'm so excited. Good morning, Dr. Sheena Mason.
Good morning, Pam. How are you?
I'm full of energy this morning because the sun is shining. And also because we have you on our show to give a lesson, as they say. So, before we get started, I always like to ask my first question, and that is, how are you and how are you keeping yourself well?
Thank you so much, Pam, and thank you for asking that question and centering self-care. And thank you, too, for having me as a guest today. I am keeping myself well by spending as much time as I can safely with my family. I have 1.5-year-old triplets who are keeping me running and giving me so much joy. And so as often as I can, I'm really focusing on being present and being engaged with them when it's quality time, and then being focused 100% on my work and activism when it's work time.
Well, you are now my new shero, the 1.5-year-old. Okay. So before we get started, I'd like to take some time, and we're going to go definitely a little deeper in your background, but I'd like to share with our listening audience a little bit about who Dr. Sheena Mason is. So we're going to take a few seconds and do that. So Dr. Mason, so all of you know, earned her PhD in English Literature with distinction in May of 2021. So this is incredible. From Howard University, she's coming out with this education and moving forward into her work and her passion work. She's assistant professor in African American literature. Currently, she teaches at Howard University and California Lutheran University. But what's important to know, she is one of the few African American women professors that has achieved a tenured role. And we'll talk about what that means later in terms of this journey. But her book entitled Decolonizing America's Racial Imagination, an Examination and Critique of Anti-Racist Discourse has been accepted by a major publishing house and will be out in early 2022. And I'm so excited about this work. She also co-authored Harlem Renaissance, a chapter of forthcoming Oxford Handbook of Ethics and Art, examining what, if anything, is a proper role for race in aesthetic productions or about members of racialized populations. And again, we'll talk a little bit more about what that means. But this person, who is Dr. Mason, her sustained interest in understanding systemic racism and how important, being a change agent is for social justice, that's what's driven her specialization in African American literature. Her other specializations are in American and Caribbean literature. I think it's important to understand the depth of her research. But through her research and teaching, she has inspired and informed many organizations in every sector on anti-racism and the revolutionary anti-racist initiatives and policy-changing efforts that are necessary to move forward. She's also committed to teaching students and helping them become better activists and organizing and being leaders within their own communities. So with that, I'm going to pause and we're going to come right back and go into a deep dive conversation with Dr. Sheena Mason on decolonizing race in America, and her journey is to change the face of what racism looks like today. So we'll be right back. Welcome back to the Inclusive Voice. I'm your host, Pam McElvane, with our special guest, Dr. Sheena Mason, and I'll be referring to her as Sheena throughout this conversation. So Sheena, here we go. This is kind of early in the morning for me to go this deep, but here we go. We've come so far with race and racism in America, but we have so much further to go when you think about some of the racial incidents that we've witnessed in our country, like slavery, civil rights, to the death of George Floyd and so many others like that. So my question to you, is racial healing possible for America?
Yes, absolutely. And I get this question from virtually every student that I teach every semester. Absolutely, it is 100% possible for healing to happen in America, but there are definitely some things that I've identified as needing to change in order to further enable the type of healing that we're talking about and hoping for.
Well, let's talk a little bit about that. I know it's kind of early to jump into that, but how can we get there? In fact, what does progress look like to you?
Yes. So one of the biggest roadblocks that Barbara and Karen Fields identify in their book Racecraft, The Soul of Inequality in American Life, is that racism, more often than not, masquerades itself as race in American society. So what they say is that racism, something an aggressor does, gets transformed into race, something the target is, in a sleight of hand that is easy to miss. This perpetuation of racecraft, this masquerading of racism as race in American society also carries over into our anti-racist efforts, where we're meaning to talk about racism, and we often feel like we are talking about racism. Most anti-racist discourse and initiatives centers on race, without recognition or consideration that race and racism are the same thing, which I think is further evidence that they are indeed the same thing. And so to give you a sort of tangible example of, well, Dr. Mason, what are you talking about with this racecraft stuff? So one example they give in the book that I think is really enlightening, they say the sentence, quote, "Black Southerners were segregated because of their skin color," end quote. Now, the Fields go on to argue that to American ears, this sentence sounds perfectly natural. When we talk about instances of racism, we often talk in this kind of language. George Floyd was murdered because he was Black. Breonna Taylor was murdered because he was Black, so on and so forth. But what they say is the racist action of the white Southerners is absent from the sentence, so that the cause of the racist action in how we talk about and frame racism ends up being the color of somebody's skin or somebody's perceived race. And they say that this, in large part, this transformation and this sort of absence of racism and the racist actors from how we talk about racism helps to perpetuate and helps the persistence of racism, because we're misidentifying the problem, we're uplifting discourse about race, and in turn, we are missing opportunity after opportunity to talk about the actual problem, which is racism. And so I kind of look at an analogy as, if you go to the doctor can prescribe you medicine to manage your cold symptoms, right, or your flu symptoms. But that medicine that he might recommend you take for a common cold is not actually solving the cold. It's solving the symptom. And so in America, we have to start getting at the root of the problem, which is not race, it's racism. And we have to talk about and uncover for ourselves how racism masquerades as race in order to have more healing dialogue and get to the place where we want to be of transformative change.
Oh, my goodness. I have to pause here based on the way you just illuminated in talking about race and racism. And so, I mean, you just, I know I'm just pausing here because, Sheena, so the institutionalization of racism and race issue or coversion, right? The covert institutionalization of race being masqueraded, as you said, with racism has been going on for generations. And so it's so embedded into the systemic practices in terms of how we live our daily lives. What you're suggesting, in order to move beyond that, we have to deal with the root cause of breaking down what people have covertly and expertly been able to masquerade with the racecraft, as you say. So you're talking about something like going all the way back to our children, like when you think about Head Start, when they first come out, being able to model in behaviors how we, how we even show up at home and then at school and then at work, because it's so embedded in terms of what we believe the distinction is. And you're just sitting here saying, no, that's not the root cause of it. No, if we really step back and see the difference, then I'm like, oh my God, because now I'm ready for this lesson to understand how we break this down, and particularly where it's manifested in institutions and in work systems and educational systems, how we even begin to do this work. But just simply hearing what you just stated, I mean, it's just mind-blowing. So let me just ask you a little bit about the racecraft. Talk a little bit more about how that is, how I don't know. I guess I was going to say just go raw and be raw about it in terms of truly how people are disguising it, whether they are aware of it or not, and what we can do, and how to recognize that you don't know the difference.
So the really important thing to consider in this discussion is that the United States has been reconstructing the meaning of race since before the American Revolutionary War of 1775 to 1783. So in other words, since before the United States came into being independent of England. Now, largely influenced by longstanding and ever-fluid European caste and class systems, race in America once reflected a caste system that, at its most complex, included white, black, and brown indentured servants who, for all intents and purposes, were enslaved, and indigenous and African people who were enslaved. And then on top of that, there were free African, indigenous, and white people. So enslavement was not racialized in the ways many of us currently understand both race and slavery until approximately 1660, when various states began outlawing miscegenation, calculating blackness, and passing fugitive slave laws. An author who explores this sort of pre-race as we now understand it time is Toni Morrison in her book, A Mercy, which I highly recommend. It's one of her most recent books. In that book, she explores this sort of threshold space of American life where people were not racialized yet, as we now understand it. Now, over time, and within the bounds of the institution of slavery, racialization came to describe the systemic practice of marking out groups of people as the subjects of violence and oppression based primarily on ancestry and phenotype, which that definition of racialization and that understanding of it should sound a lot like how one might define racism. And so racialization came to reflect one's access to power, even if not one's possession of power. And then slowly but surely over time, race came to be understood in the ways that we now think of it. Black coming to describe people of African descent who were considered by law and practice to be enslaved and chattel. And then after emancipation, under suffering Jim Crow, right? And then now the new Jim Crow, and so on and so forth. So that the meaning of Black was always inevitably tied to what it meant to be victimized by a system of racism. And then on the flip side of that, what it meant to be white has pretty consistently meant what it means to be on the other side of victimization, right? What it means to be a perpetrator. And so if blackness and whiteness have come to be metaphors for what it means to be either racist or a victim of racism, then I think that is further evidence to the idea that indeed racism masquerades itself as race. And if that's the case, then there's no amount of reconstructing how we understand race, whether it be blackness, whiteness, etc., that will liberate the people being described as black or white, etc., in the ways that we're really hoping for. And so one of my pretty strong positions is that we have to equip and educate ourselves on other philosophies of race that have traditionally remained excluded and marginalized, and stop this sort of default position of race, which is that we must just reconstruct it, that is more practical or logical, because ultimately at the end of the day, our reconstructionist efforts have taken us pretty far, right? We've definitely seen progress, as you mentioned at the start of this conversation. But to get us to where we're actually trying to liberate ourselves, each other, and our communities, reconstruction is not going to do it, because racism is hiding in race and even in how we talk about it. So happy to go into philosophy. Yes.
Yeah. Let's take this question. So that is so good. Thank you. And that was so clear in helping us understand truly the manifestation and how the caste system impacted and has been built upon it year over. We're going to take our first caller from Jim, who has a question around the race riots and Mike Pence. Hey, Jim, good morning. Thanks for calling in.
Good morning. Good morning. If that was a racist attack on our capital, I know what was. That was definitely a racist attack on our capital. What's curious is Pence hasn't been interviewed. They were going to hang him in front of the place. And nobody's attempted to interview him. He's been completely silent since January 6th. And now they're going to stop the investigation. If that wasn't a racist attack on our capital, I don't know what was. Anyway, you guys have a good morning. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim. You want to take a stab at commenting on that one, Sheena?
Well, one thing that I encourage students to think about, Jim, is what does the labeling of something as being racist do? What does it accomplish? And once we identify something as being a sort of racist event or racist happening, what other things are influencing that, right? Because I think we tend to talk about racism in very black and white terms, pun intended. And I don't think it necessarily does the kind of critical, transformative work that we're actually striving for. So it's one thing to acknowledge an event or happening or a policy, right, as being racist, and then it's quite another thing to work towards solution.
Yeah, I have to agree with you on that. I agree because it appears to be racially motivated. At the end of the day, the assault on the Capitol was around justice, was around, or injustice. If someone thinks it just so happened to be with a group that had certain ideals and ideology that, again, like you were saying, kind of manifested the this whole thing of what your belief systems are. So I think that's kind of difficult, because then you have media, right, that perpetuates whatever that idea and that notion is, and then coupled with what's happening, right, with when you talk about events like police brutality towards black and brown, and then you have this other kind of violent events, it does get convoluted and confused. So I really am looking forward to have more understanding of this concept of decolonization with you, Sheena, to help us think through what we need to do. And I definitely am going to take hold, and I say all of us do, that we're going to have to equip and educate ourselves about other philosophies around race and racism. So keep throwing out the reading for us, because and the resources. That's going to be really critical for us in this continued conversation. So we'll be right back. Thank you, Jim, for always the good comments. We'll take a commercial break, and we'll be right back with you. Welcome back to the Inclusive Voice, and our guests, please feel free to call in at 773-763-9278. So, Sheena, I'd like to just take a pause here and take a couple minutes and just, talk a little bit to you about your journey and study in African American literature and your passion around the work. So, saw that where you started your education, but let's get a little personal here and share with us a little bit, what has inspired you to do this work and to focus on literature.
Cool. Okay, Pam. You say, let's get personal, so I'm going to get personal indeed. I was adopted. Two of my biological brothers died under suspicious circumstances under the care of my biological parents. Subsequently, my sisters and I were taken away by the state of New York and placed up for adoption. However, in my adopted family, I was subsequently severely abused and neglected. One of the things that I had access to, though, were countless books and a really good and decent education. And so it's that part of my childhood that I attribute to really having saved my life. I read voraciously. It was an escape for me. The abuse was so bad that I moved out on my 16th birthday, and I actually chose homelessness over staying in that household. This led to me having to drop out of high school my senior year. Should have been the best year of my life. I was an AP student. I was taking 2 college classes for college credit. I was a varsity athlete, had all of the mixings of what should have been the best year of my life. And I found myself sleeping on park benches, Pam, and a high school dropout. But because I had access to books and because I had access to the education that I did have, I always knew that there was something, that there was more to life and that there was something beyond my struggle. And it is with that sort of fierceness and passion for education, for literature in particular, and for activism, being the kind of activist I yearned for at that time, that I take with me to this day, and that I insist on doing this type of work because I really believe that you can turn your mess into a message. And so it's my life's purpose, and I'm just fulfilling it.
Oh, my goodness. I thank you. Thank you for being vulnerable and sharing your story. I, too, me and my siblings, after the loss of life from my brother, were adopted by our grandparents. Differences, we're adopted by a loving family. So you just described what one can do if given the opportunity, and hence why we want to have so much passion to change the way folks are looking at people of color and what they're doing to each other. I would just say what an inspiring story to share in terms of what has propelled you forward. What would you say were some of the the key influencers in your life today that keeps you inspired for doing this work?
Well, two of the people that had the biggest impact on me as a child that I look back with great fondness, even decades later, that I really feel like helped keep my hope alive and my spirit alive. One was my second grade teacher, Miss Morris. I wish I could find her now. I've tried so hard to find her on social media, but I don't know her first name, and she's probably married, and I don't know her married name. But even at that age, being in second grade, I remember she got down on eye level with me and put her hands on my shoulders and just looked me in my eyes. And I don't remember what she said, but I just remember feeling seen. And it is that moment that I really take with me everywhere I go, that I want people, regardless of their backgrounds, regardless of their education, their class, their gender, etc., to feel seen and valued and heard and loved and embraced. Because at the end of the day, one of the barriers to, I guess you could say, proper healing, especially as it pertains to racism in this country, is our frequent inability and unwillingness to hear from people who are saying things that we at first glance disagree with. And I think if more people just led with love, led with compassion, we could certainly get a lot further along.
So thank you for that. So let's do a real-time exercise. Okay, don't beat me up for this when you see me, okay? So when I say, I want you to say to me, I want to be seen, I want to be heard, and I want to be understood. So the first thing I want you to say, with the pause, say again, I want to be seen.
I want to be seen.
I see you. I want to be heard.
I want to be heard.
I hear you. I want to be understood.
I want to be understood.
I understand you. That was an intentional pause, because to your point, if we could pause and take a minute and go deeper and reflect inside the person that's standing before us, regardless of how different they may appear, if we can begin to just do some of these basic elements, that would move us forward. So thank you for participating in my real-time exercise.
Thank you.
So I just, before we get back into the meat of stuff, I just wanted to ask you, in your bio, it ends by saying you're ready to share your wealth and knowledge and experience toward the goal of creating equity where it lacks and building communities resistant to the status quo. So what legacy are you hoping to leave in your fight for creating equity?
Whew, that is a deep question. Well, ultimately, all of my efforts through my assistant professorship, through my work with Freedom Summer Collegiate, through my work with Theory of Racelessness, I aim to be later, hopefully decades later, known as a person who gave the fight her all, who sees people, who hears people, and who loves people, and who was always compassionate toward herself as well, in her own humanity, right? That's certainly how I would want my family to think of me. And if I'm fortunate enough to amplify my voice in the ways that I aspire, then I'm hoping to have a bigger change and have people study my work, decades from now after I'm gone, and to think of me in those ways as well.
Excellent. Well, I'll do my part to help elevate your work for sure. So, what are I'm back on your triplets. What do you have? Are they how many boys and girls, or are girls, are boys? What is the gender of them?
So I have two boys. They're identical, Josiah and Skylar, and I have a baby girl, Tatiana.
Okay. All right. Woo. The balancing act. I'm telling you, it's still, you have to be young. And where are you calling from, Sheena?
I'm in Baltimore, Maryland.
All righty. So thank you. Thank you for joining us this early for this incredible journey. So before we go, let's see, we have a few minutes before commercial. I think I'll save this question a little later because I want to be able to go deep a little bit more into this notion of decolonizing. But let me just have you set us up and define what you mean by decolonizing for our audience.
Ooh, yes. So my efforts in terms of decolonizing have primarily to do with letting go of the parts of our thinking, the parts of our practices, policies, initiatives, etc., that are largely, if not primarily, influenced and inspired by colonialism and imperialism, by practices and histories that do not benefit us. Audre Lorde was kind of infamous in saying that one cannot dismantle the master's house with the master's tools. I don't know that I agree 100% with that, but I think in the case, at least when it comes to race and racism and the sort of race-racism evasion, I think that there is some merit to that. And so those efforts I call decolonizing.
Excellent. With that, we're going to take a break and we'll be right back to continue the examination of what we need to do to decolonize race in America. We'll be right back. Welcome back. I'm your host, Pam McElvane, on The Inclusive Voice, with our special guest, Dr. Sheena Mason. Please feel free to call in with comments or questions at 773-763-9278. So we were just talking about what decolonizing means to Dr. Mason, and I like letting go of the old practices and history that prevents us and not beneficial for us moving forward. And so when you think about the events and the activities and the protests, I just want to ask, and putting into context, when you have organizations that are taking certain initiatives and certain events, and then they're protesting and leveraging the power of their voices, but they are inciting and inspiring, this emotion to do something, to help change. What advice and practices would you say when we do see these negative events occur that you would tell organizers that they should consider?
I think my biggest ask of as many people as possible, especially those who are organizing intently and trying to be strategic about the kinds of outcomes they're demanding and asking for at the same time, centers the idea that the language and the discourse we use in those moments in between time is not new. We've had countless civil rights movements across history, right? And the primary goal of all of those movements was reconstructing what it means to be racialized in this country and reconstructing it in a way that makes it more positive. But part of the biggest problems in that effort, besides the fact that it's gotten us, I think, as far as it can, is that we tend to sit in 2021 and feel like and argue, well, this generation is going to be the one who just finally cracks the code and successfully reconstructs race. And I wish I could say I was optimistic about that project, because I know history and I know that we've been constantly reconstructing race since before the beginning, right? So I would like to see more openness for people doing this kind of important and critical work to other philosophies of race outside of Reconstruction. And first and foremost, that requires a sort of acknowledgement that there are other alternatives to reconstructing race that could actually take us a lot further.
Oh, that's good. That's so good to hear that you plainly articulated what needs to happen. I had Dr. Steele on the show in January, the president and CEO of the Southern Christian Leadership Council, and he was just alluding to around Black Lives Matter and what he felt that. He said, in the civil rights, one thing Dr. King did was they trained the protesters, right? So even whatever the initiative was at that time, or initiatives, they were trained in terms of how to protest. So he was saying, so we need to take a lesson from history and move forward. So, what you said is to be open to others' philosophy around race. And I definitely will become more open and become a student, and am becoming a student of learning more. But I will tell you, I am one of those guilty in thinking of the optimism or having optimism that our next generation was going to have significant impact and change. But when I hear the realities that you bring forward, there's so much more work that has to be done simultaneously to really make a difference in doing that. So I thank you for that candid sharing. So the next thing I would like to just have you, it's a little shifting a little bit, but I was a little bit fascinated by, when I was reading in your bio, the work that you did, if I even say this right. You were chosen by Cannon Collins, Braid Boss, and to talk a little bit about that, where you were, committed to bringing women together around various topics, and then getting recognized. You've been recognized in so many different facets and avenues of your life, which I think is great, because that really shows the whole person. But share a little bit about some of your personal commitment and what you've been doing, in the community with messages and organizations like beauty and motherhood and business and these different things.
Yeah, so I have a YouTube channel, www.youtube.com/C/Queen She, like Queen Sheena. So my YouTube channel, I initially was inspired to create as another form of my activism. My thought process was, hey, I can build this platform where I'm bringing in particularly racialized women of color, even more particularly Black women, under the umbrella of everything to do with hair, wigs, all of that. And in being my authentic self and sharing other aspects of like who I am outside of the beauty world, I was hoping to inspire as many people as possible to embrace themselves and each other in the kinds of ways that I was working at the same time to navigate figuring out how do I embrace myself completely too. When you have any amount of trauma as a child, this journey towards self-love, if you will, can be a tenuous one. And so I was wanting to sort of exemplify the same spirit that I was wanting people to embrace me with. And I had some amount of success pretty quickly. I reached something like 5,000 subscribers before the conclusion of my first year. And so people were really taken to me and my spirit. And then Decolonizing, I won a Braid Boss contest. I got to do a modeling shoot it was a video shoot and also photos. I was in Hyper magazine talking about my PhD coursework and my YouTube channel. And so that was just one branch of my activism. I more recently started transitioning that channel. Once I got to Howard University in 2016, I recognized that I was not going to be able to keep the same urgency with my channel because I was focused on finishing my doctorate. But the content that I have recently been putting up is leaning more toward my educational activism. So I put my dissertation defense video on there. I'm starting a podcast in July, which I'm really excited about because I'm going to talk about all things philosophy of race. And so I'm rebranding it, but the spirit of activism, bringing people together, remains the same. And then outside of that, I do what I call grassroots work with Freedom Summer Collegiate. They're a nonprofit. They work with underserved high school students in Mississippi primarily, sometimes parts of Arkansas. They provide college credit and college-level courses to those high schoolers. And so as their program manager, I'm bringing this year's programming to life by working with PhD students and PhD candidates from across the country who are bringing these like really cool, dope classes to students who deserve it. And that's just one attempt to, I guess, fill the achievement gap or the opportunity gap, as it's also called. So, yeah, I have many different facets of my activism, but essentially I have one thing in common that's like driving those efforts.
So I'm going to put you on the spot now. So I would love to do maybe a 3-show podcast series where you and I are talking about, this notion of decolonizing and really looking at race and race philosophy in a different way, what you can do personally to reconstruct it in the workplace. You're up for that?
Oh, yeah. Okay. I'm up for that. I'm up for the challenge and the conversation.
Okay, let's do it. And so I think that's great because they hear the whole part of you and in every aspect in what you're doing. So as we wrap up, just real quickly, I want to congratulate you on your position that you're going to be taking in August 2021. Can you tell us a little bit about that? And then also let's end the show with giving folks a nugget that what they can do to become an activist for change.
Yeah, so I'm so excited. I received an assistant professor in African American literature tenure track position at SUNY Oneonta, State University of New York in Oneonta, New York. I'm super excited because generally speaking, the academic job market is extremely competitive. A lot of people trying to fill very few roles. The pandemic increased and sort of exacerbated that competitiveness. And so I'm like super thrilled that I locked that in. My family is moving there at the end of July. I couldn't be more excited. And they're very supportive of my anti-racist work, which I think is like really essential. I didn't have to hide any part of who I am.
Congratulations on that. That is so huge. So congratulations. And
Thank you.
What nugget, as we close the show, what nugget would you leave for folks to be able to just do one thing to support the movement?
I would say read anything by James Baldwin or Toni Morrison. And then also the book Racecraft by Barbara and Karen Fields. You can find a free PDF version of that by just Googling Racecraft, The Soul of Inequality by Barbara and Karen Fields. A PDF will come up. So read that book as fast as you can because it's going to be transformative and life-changing, I promise you.
Oh, excellent. And thank you. I'll go download that and put that on our website, www.diversityandbamagazine.com. Oh, my goodness, Dr. Sheena Mason, what an incredible conversation. So thank you for your time this morning, and we wish you the very best.
Thank you so much, Pam, and thanks to everyone listening. Thank you.
Okay, we'll see you all next week.